Ah, fair Bretonnia, a land of magic and chivalry located west of the Empire across the Grey Mountains in a world beset by dragons, gunpowder weapons and dinosaurs. You might think a bunch of poncy French-sounding bastards on horses shouting "For's a lady" and flouncing about in fancy dress might be a tad out of their depth. You're not entirely wrong. During the kingdom's infancy it hit some trouble. A vast orc war beset the lands, and as Bretonnia was not a unified kingdom at that time, each individual lord fought alone and one by one fell. One, however, was not so easily beaten. Duke Giles the Breton rallied his fellow dukes, Thierulf de Lyonesse and Landuin de Mousillon, to his banner, but it was not enough. After a defeat, the battered allied forces, facing utter destruction, camped next to a lake, waiting for the morning and their inevitable death. But in true Deus Ex Machina fashion, while Giles the Breton was drinking from that lake, a watery tart did appear, and Giles immediately asked her to bless his banner, which I assume was some form of fruity Bretonnian euphemism, but the moist bint took it literally, and so did indeed bless his banner. Giles dipped his battered and tatty banner into the lake, and when he withdrew it, it was now totally dry and restored to its former glory, with a golden grail now emblazoned upon its silk. The other knights and dukes did likewise, calling for the hydrated trollop to bless their banners and weapons. I imagine one or two probably chucked their horses in there for good measure. The three dukes, now Grail knights, were more than human, and come the morning, their armies gathered around them. The orc horde advanced and loosed arrows at the small Bretonnian force, but the Grail knights and their army didn't flinch a bit. Sure, one or two peasants probably died horribly, but who cares about them? Then the knights charged. They smashed through the first line of greenskins, and the second, and the third. The orcs faltered, their tiny brains slowly comprehending that this wasn't going entirely to plan. The greenskins broke and fled, and after the battle, huge numbers of them lay dead. The three dukes then returned to the lake and swore an oath to stay united until Bretonnia was free of threats, and granting Giles the power and resources of all dukedoms until that time. The three Grail knights rode across the land, putting things right that once went wrong, and hoping each time that their last leap would be the leap. Well, that's the quantum leap. Well, you know what I mean. They went around gathering yet more dukes their banner and doing generally good deeds. Each time the dukes would gain the favour of the damp floozy, and so yet another Grail knight was born. Eventually the kingdom was safe. Giles was named the Uniter, and the Fey Enchantress, who had popped up along the way as a representative of the clammy harlot, made him the king of all Bretonnia, and there was much rejoicing. Unfortunately, a few years later, Giles was shot by an orc arrow and dropped dead, but not before asking his dukes to be put on a small raft and floated into the lake that he first saw the saturated Hussy. And so they did, because, well, I mean, why not? And he disappeared into the mist of the lake and was never seen again. Well, he was sort of seen again. We'll get to that. Then the problem was, who do we make king now? Giles' son, Lewis, was next in line, but he wasn't a Grail Knight like his father because he just wanted to sing.
Cut that out! Cut that out!
The other knights agreed that he shouldn't sing, but should go out on a quest to get the blessing of the dank Jezebel. And so he did, after riding across the lands, putting things right that once went... Oh, that's Quantum Leap again. He returned after doing some good things, but this time with glowy eyes and a ruddy great lightsaber. Everyone agreed that he was pretty badass, and now they let him be king, which was nice. Louis immediately set a codes of honour and chivalry in stone and formalised a Bretonnian state, which you might think was set up as feudalism, but in fact was more of a archo-syndicalistic commune where people take turns as a sort of executive officer for the week, although decisions that officer must be approved at a bi-weekly meeting by a simple majority in the case of purely internal affairs, but no, just kidding, it was feudalism. Following in Louis' footsteps, other knights took up the Grail quest, leaving their lands and possessions to become questing knights. Keen on making allies, Louis also sent envoys to the Wood Elves in Athel-Loren, and the Wood Elves, for their own Machiavellian reasons, agreed to this treaty, which stands to this day, although sometimes Orion leaves the forest to hunt down some peasants for fun, but who cares about that, and in some ways it's just sort of pest control. In 1448, Estalia is invaded by an evil sultan named Jafar. It's always Jafar. And it's always a vizier. And the embattled city-states called for aid from the northern neighbours. Both Bretonnia and the Imperial Knightly Orders answered the call and travelled south to do battle with the evil Sultan. They crushed his armies and followed his retreating forces back across the sea to sandy Araby, despite the Warhammer world not knowing what oil is. They laid siege and overwhelmed each of Jafar's fortresses one by one until the Sultan himself was impaled upon a Bretonnian lance. Some knightly orders remained in Araby after the war and set up enclaves of crusader kingdoms. Another force which had been marching across the Badlands never made it to Araby, but instead decided to clean out the surrounding lands of orcs, and some settled there in what we now know as the Border Princes. In 1786, the Red Pox swept the kingdom, making the peasants look and smell slightly worse than usual. Many more died of the illness than would usually do so, and once the populations had been decimated, the Skaven launched their attack from below cities and towns. Some towns were more affected than others, and Bordello was rife with plague in the slums of the city, and it looked like it might spill out from the slums into areas people actually gave a flying toss about. Fortunately, the Baron of Bordello had the answer. Lock all the doors, set it on fire. Job done. Truly a visionary. Despite such heroic actions as setting all the peasants on fire, soon cities and towns of Bretonnia were desperately fighting against a veritable sea of ratmen. Brionne and Quenelles were under siege and close to falling. But in Mousillon, dark things were occurring, as Duke Meravesh, Lord of Mousillon, conspired with evil things to protect him and his city from the plague. He set out from Mousillon with his Grail Knights, all now decked in black armour, which is always a good sign and never a foreshadowing that they are all totally evil. They set out to relieve the cities. The loony Duke thought he was Landuin reborn. Linking up with the armies of Paravon and the Wood Elves, the united forces smashed into Skaven and routed them, winning a great victory and securing Bretonnia from the Ratmen menace. But Meravesh enjoyed himself a little bit too much, bludgeoning Skaven corpses until they'd been reduced into puddles of gore, like certain people on Reddit who just can't get over themselves, and covering himself with blood. He invited all the knights to a party at his place, and not to be rude, everyone agreed because he'd kind of saved the day, and they all popped over. They were somewhat surprised to see the Duke's choice of decor was impaled criminals, and that his servants were looking a bit listless and somewhat dead even for normal Bretonnian peasants. The king was aghast and formally challenged the Duke to combat, whereby the Duke pulled the king's head off and drank his blood. It was at this point that some at the dinner party suggested the Duke might be a touch evil, partly because of the whole king throat-ripping, blood-drinking thing, but also the real shocking thing had been how he'd neglected to serve an amuse-bouche before the entrees. The knights and dukes fled Mousillon, tailed by zombled peasants and other dark apparitions. The Fey Enchantress immediately excommunicated the Duke and named a successor king. Leonesi raised an army to deal with the corrupted Duke, and many joined their banners. The Duke was defeated, but Mousillon was forever cursed, and it's not the last time the Duke would pop up and ruin events with poor manners. Life in Bretonnia, and indeed the Warhammer world, as we've heard, is considered pretty brutal generally, but the lot of the Bretonnian peasants is probably amongst the worst there is. In exchange for protection from their liege lord, the average peasant can expect to pay 9/10 of what they produce, which means while the nobility dine upon fine wines, fruit, vegetables and meats, the peasants usually eat rocks, with a garnish of mud, if they're lucky. They're also unable to leave their lands, which aren't very large and are expected to reproduce like rabbits to continue to support the kingdom's infrastructure as well as its armies. Everyone likes cannon fodder. This rather unsavoury combination tends to lead to inbreeding, and so the average Bretonnian peasant probably has more in common with Quasimodo than a human. You might think this might bother them, but fear not, because they're totally illiterate and uneducated, so they don't really do much thinking. The Bretonnian peasantry, therefore, are almost subhuman and certainly have a harder life than most humans, and certainly far more restricted. Social mobility is almost zero. Even the language they speak is different to the nobility. High Bretonnian and Low Bretonnian are so varied that even if someone who grew up with Low Bretonnian as a language learns High Bretonnian, distinctly rare, the inflections and accent mean they stand out like a sore thumb, so natural-born Bretonnian nobility can always spot an incomer and hoot at them in derision. You might consider that the ladies' virtues and nobility and knightly conduct might not gel particularly well with treating their fellow man slightly worse than livestock, but hypocrisy is hardly a trait limited to the Kingdom of Bretonnia, only usually people try to hide it a bit better. Many knights, while feigning adherence to the laws of chivalry, are complete and utter wankers, a fact which should really surprise no one. While this sounds bad, Grail Knights are a step above normal men and must have the purest of hearts to attain their status. As the king is always a Grail Knight, the king is therefore a shining paragon of virtue. Of course, the king can only paragon of virtue wrongs he knows exists, and Bretonnia is a big kingdom. Also, peasants aren't allowed to talk to the king to bring grievance to light, so basically it's not great being a peasant in Bretonnia. The Lady of the Lake, aka the Sodden Jezebel, is the primary deity of Bretonnia, and has been ever since Giles de Breton propositioned her at the lake long ago. Peasants aren't allowed to worship her, of course, but they tend to do it anyway. The primary mouthpiece of the moistened bint is the Fey Enchantress, who is revered across Bretonnia. When the current king dies, the Fey Enchantress picks who gets next pop, which is no basis for a system of government if you ask me, but no one did. The Fey Enchantress also travels the lands finding anyone with magical potency and carries them off, with the girls returning as damsels who themselves are potent magic users and who are agents of the Fey Enchantress, while the boys are never seen again. So not only does she get to pick the king, but she also steals children, which, as job descriptions go, is pretty varied in scope. Grail chapels dot the landscape of Bretonnia in places where the lady has appeared or thought to have appeared, and are often guarded by Grail Knights who set up shop to defend these places from evil. Grail Knights are superhuman and glow with unnatural but warming light. They can fight longer, harder and better than any knight in the Warhammer world. Grail Knights are revered by the local populace to such a level that even the bones of Grail Knights are considered holy, and to traipse them into battle is something apparently Bretonnian peasants do. I guess if all you've got to look forward to after a hard day working on the fields is to return home to a feast of cowpat and wheeze from your partner who is more wart than wife, while your 15 hunchback simpleton children sit around in a circle playing a game of catch the rock with your face, then maybe running away, finding a dead knight and carrying him to certain death seems like a step up. Grail Knights may be the ultimate champions of the Jewish strumpet, but before they became Grail Knights, they were questing knights, having gone on a long-ass quest to find and proposition her. These questing knights travel the lands, having forsworn their possessions and titles, carrying their life with them like a heavily armoured littlest hobo. They wander Bretonnia and sometimes the world, righting wrongs and searching for the blessing of the lady. Most knights in Bretonnia, though, are knights of the realm, bog-standard jousting types. These nobles hold lands and titles and will come to the aid of their liege lord if summoned. They are supposedly paragons of virtue and knightly order, but in effect most of them are just pricks who think highly of themselves. Below the knights of the realm are the knights errant, young nobility looking to prove themselves on the battlefield or anywhere really, generally far more impetuous than their older and wiser brethren. These young bucks can often, on their noble steeds, be found doing donuts in the local Tesco car park at 2 AM, accompanied by a heavy flute and lute combo. Bretonnia then is a shining land of knightly virtue, honour and order. Or a cesspit of hypocrisy and corruption. It's up for you to decide, but it's the latter. Let's face it, for some reason Games Workshop made Bretonnia literally the worst place in the entire Warhammer world to live for someone who isn't a rich tosser. The only upside being, hey, the Grail Knights are okay guys though? Yeah, great, sure. And the rest of them? Utter wankers. And the king? A good guy apparently. But did he do anything about this whole shebang? No. And how did he get to be king anyway? Because apparently some saturated doxy strumpet said so. And that's virtue? I'll tell you how he got there: by exploiting the workers, by hanging on to outdated imperialist dogma which perpetuates the economic and social differences in our society. If there's going to be any